over the next few hours. Thanks for being with us. Up next, a forum titled Government Secrecy, What Does Congress Need to Know?, which was sponsored today by People for the American Way.
My name is Art Croft, and I am president of People for the American Way. We have a lot of work to do this morning, so I am only going to be here briefly. I only have one chore, and that's to make the first introduction. Often I think it's easier for the press, certainly our opponents, and even our friends, to think of People for the American Way as Norman Lear's People for the American Way. And though he would be the first to scoff at that kind of description, as president of the organization, I will tell you that his heart and his soul and his passion and his commitment fills the place. And it's a commitment that is so engaging and so contagious that Americans from all over the country, from every region of the country, every state, 270,000 of them, turn Norman Lear's idea into People for the American Way. It is my honor to welcome to Washington and to introduce to you today a man who loves his country deeply, passionately, who has fought for it and fights for it every day of his life. Why? Because it's his responsibility. He is a citizen. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Norman Lear.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am the engaging and contagious Norman Lear. Engaging and contagious. Well, we're going to see if you, how many of you walk out of here 65, if I am truly contagious, Jewish, if I'm truly contagious, and members of People for the American Way. We were talking in the rear, some of us, some of the gentlemen on the panel, and I, and about the many issues, difficult issues the country faces, among them the one we're here to discuss today. And I said to Mr. Colby, reminds me of the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. We certainly live in interesting times. And he remembered another Chinese saying, which was that a happy country is a country without history. And I love that. And this room is a country in which we have all, by the miracle of television, lived through a lot of history. The happy part of being an American citizen is the challenge to keep the stability and the strength and the integrity that one feels in these surroundings. This morning I could be described as feeling like some kind of proud father. As one who was present 8 years ago at the creation of People for the American Way, when we started off as a post office box and a 60-second television spot, I take an enormous pride in the fact that we are now providing a forum for this very distinguished panel. My guess is that most of you would be familiar with People for the American Way for our jousting matches with Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, our bouts with textbook censorship, our role in several controversial judicial nominations, and other very visible battles that we have fought in the glare of the national media. But in truth, we were founded not so much to oppose those individuals and movements as to promote constitutional liberties, democratic values, and the wonderful heritage of institutions and practices that are the American way. Our purpose is not so much to agitate and polemicize as to promote participation in public debates and in the democratic process itself. At a time when too many of our fellow citizens fail even to vote on Election Day, and when a distressingly large number of our young people young and old alike, are unable to answer even the simplest questions about the Constitution. We try to be a kind of floating civics education class for our fellow citizens and, not least of all, for ourselves. When I think of civic education, I remember not only the lessons I learned in the classroom, but also the lessons I learned at home. It was my grandfather. He was a Russian immigrant, tall, slender, proud, straight as a die, who taught me the meaning of citizenship. A number of you who heard me before know I love to talk about my grandfather, because he used to write all of his elected representatives, but especially his president. And every letter to the president, I lived with him from the time I was 10 to about 12 and a half, every letter to the president used to start the same way. He wrote, "My dearest darling Mr. President, you should never have listened to them when they said so-and-so and such and such. You have every right to so-and-so and such and such." And even when he disagreed with the president, the letters began the same way. "My dearest darling Mr. President, you should never have said such and such or done such and such." And of course, I was the youngest there, and I was the one directed to travel the 4 flights of stairs down below to pick up the mail. And every once in a while, 74 York Street, New Haven, Connecticut, there would be this little white envelope addressed to my grandfather that said White House on it. And that 11-year-old heart would pound. My grandfather receiving a letter from the White House. I could never, ever get over it. And it made me an inveterate letter writer to my president and my elected representatives. I owe all of that to him. But this is the kind of activist citizenship that People for the American Way has tried to promote. That reverence for our system, that indignation when it fails to live up to its promise, and above all, that rambunctious zest for participation in the public issues of our time. And when I think of my earliest civics lesson, I think it is absolutely right and natural that People for the American Way should be sponsoring this forum on the growth of government secrecy and what it means for Congress and for all of us as citizens. When considering the issues that plague our nation today, I take some solace in 3 of the basic civics lessons I learned in the classroom and at home. First, our democratic system requires the participation of an informed and active citizenry. It needs people like my grandfather, people who not only vote on Election Day, but take the time to learn about and debate public issues, and when necessary, tell their elected officials exactly what is on their mind. But to do that, to participate in democracy, citizens need to know what their government is doing. And that is why secrecy is such a profound enemy of the democratic process. A second lesson I learned is that government officials are human beings like the rest of us. They understand that the control of information is a form of power. And so they tend to hoard that information which can enhance their power. Sometimes they have the best intentions in the world. Other times they are trying to evade public scrutiny and judgment of their actions. In either case, democracy cannot work with a constricted flow of information. The third and arguably most important civics lesson that continually renews my optimism in this nation is the genius of our system of government. The framers had a marvelous understanding of human nature. Mindful of the vanity and frailties to which even the occupants of the most exalted offices in the land are vulnerable, the framers devised the separation of powers, a system which brings power and accountability into balance and allows the will of the people to prevail. Yes, there are inefficiencies in the separation of powers into 3 branches. And yes, it is often exasperating for those in power to answer an inquisitive press acting as the people's eyes and ears, reporting on what their government is doing in their name. But no one said that self-governance would be a picnic. It is hard work. It can get messy and awkward and occasionally very nasty. But as even our adversaries in the Kremlin are discovering, a system of centralized power coddled by official secrecy and little accountability to the people is a dead-end street. It saps the vitality and creativity and the stability of the nation. I'm sure many of you understand these civic lessons far better than I. I repeat them only to explain why I, as a citizen, and the citizens' organization which I helped to found, are so concerned about the phenomenal growth of government secrecy in recent years. As Arthur Schlesinger, Jr. writes so cogently and concisely in his introduction to People For's report on government secrecy, secrecy is the bane of democracy because it is the enemy of accountability. Of course, there are secrets that government officials and responsible citizens must keep. As a combat veteran of World War II, I remember those posters, mostly on the home front, with such famous slogans as "Loose lips sink ships." But there were very few loose lips during World War II because Americans, as a free people, understood what was at stake and agreed that legitimate secrets had to be kept from our enemies. But as I scanned the study of government secrecy which People For has published, what struck me over and over again was that a very different kind of government secrecy has emerged during the past 4 decades, and especially during the past 7 years. Secrecy has been pursued not as a necessary evil, but as an end in itself. Secrets are being kept not from our adversaries, but from our elected leaders in Congress and from the American people. And so secrecy is embraced less, it seems, to protect the national security than to insulate government officials from public debate and from criticism. As a citizen, I find all of these developments disturbing and ominous. The growth of government secrecy represents a challenge to our democratic heritage that we citizens, led by our elected representatives in the Congress, must boldly confront. I find it appropriate and richly symbolic that we convene this forum here in the Russell Hearing Room, where a joint committee of Congress assumed its responsibility to investigate a terrible scandal conceived secretly, conducted illegally, and deeply contemptuous of our constitutional system of government and of the rule of law. There could be no better time to address the issue of government secrecy than during an election year, when Americans are evaluating the policies of the past 7 years and preparing to meet the challenges of the next decade and the next century. So, let's let the discussion begin. I look forward to the civics lesson I will learn today, and I couldn't ask for a finer, more distinguished group of teachers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Norman. I'm John Buchanan, Chairman of People for the American Way, and I'd like to speak very briefly about a special concern that I, along with many people in this room, bring to the issue of government secrecy, a concern that goes to the heart of the Constitution. Having served as a member of Congress for 16 years, I'm especially sensitive to the important responsibilities of the legislative branch, both as lawmakers and as representatives of the people. I also believe strongly that the executive branch, in its national security and policy-making role, has its own prerogatives, which are especially necessary in the dangerous nuclear era in which we live. But in governing our nation, we must take the Constitution as our guidepost. You know, our nation's founders didn't trust anyone with absolute power. They were smart enough to write a Constitution that provided for shared powers and shared responsibilities. Balancing national security with the people's right to know is therefore a difficult and daunting task, and our history makes at least 2 things very clear. First, the necessary balance can only be achieved through a true partnership between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Second, whenever that partnership breaks down, the result is disaster. The Bay of Pigs, a Watergate, or an Iran Contra. I believe that in recent years, the partnership between the executive and legislative branches has been stretched to the breaking point. People For has been monitoring government secrecy closely for more than 2 years and recently published a major study of the issue. The study documents how secrecy has disrupted the partnership. The Pentagon's classified or black budget, kept secret even from most members of Congress, has grown from $5 billion in 1981 to an estimated $35 billion today. This means that more than 10% of the entire defense budget has been excluded from congressional oversight. This secret budget is larger than the entire defense budget of any other country on earth, except the Soviet Union. Reversing a 30-year trend, the annual volume of classified documents has increased dramatically, up by 66% between 1986 and 1987 alone. And even documents already released to the public have been reclassified. The administration has issued through the National Security Council at least 296 secret orders called National Security Decision Directives, or NSDDs, carrying the force of law. Many have been used to hide national security decision-making from Congress and the public, from Congress and the public in a wide range of areas, including the Iran Contra affair. I'm sure that some of our panelists may not agree that these examples illustrate a dangerous trend. In fact, I'd almost be disappointed if you all agreed with me. But I would like to further engage our distinguished guest by arguing that in its zeal for secrecy, the current administration has gone far beyond legitimate national security needs. We believe that this explosion of secrecy has cut off the people's right to know what their government is doing in their name and keeps Congress from performing its constitutional role of oversight. Whatever your views on what does Congress need to know, I would submit to you one thing. We must reestablish a true legislative-executive partnership, a partnership that balances legitimate national security with our citizens' right to know. This is particularly timely as we face the end of one presidency and prepare for the next. But this problem did not begin with the Reagan administration, and it will not end with it. People 4 has formulated some proposals for change. The Congress has taken some steps for reform, and I'm sure our panel will have many suggestions for future policy. I look forward to hearing from you all, and I'll ask you please to take your places on the podium. And we don't want any secrecy here. They're all very distinguished, but we don't want a veil of secrecy to cloak who they are. So if you'll all just come up here, I'll introduce you one by one. And I would suggest you sit behind your name card. That's reasonable. Now, I'm not going to introduce them in the order they're sitting, but alphabetically, so you'll have to use your eyes and your heads. But I think between their distinguished faces and their name cards, you can identify them all. Scott Armstrong is Executive Director of the National Security Archive. He's a former investigative reporter at the Washington Post. He edited the Chronology, the documented day-by-day account of the secret military assistance to Iran and the Contras. He co-authored with Bob Woodward The Brethren and assisted Woodward and Carl Bernstein with the final days. He was senior investigator for the Senate Watergate Committee. Scott Armstrong. William Colby was director of the Central Intelligence Agency from 1973 to 1976. He had been chief of the CIA's Far East Division from 1963 to 68 and executive director and comptroller from 72 to 73. He served with American embassies in Stockholm, Rome, and Saigon from 51 to 62 and was ambassador and deputy to the commander of the U.S. Military Assistance Command in Vietnam from 1968 to 1971. Mr. Colby currently practices law in Washington. Charles Cooper is Assistant Attorney General and head of the Office of Legal Counsel in the U.S. Department of Justice. He served previously as Deputy Assistant Secretary General in the Civil Rights Division. He was a law clerk for Judge Paul Roney of the Fifth Circuit and for Justice William Rehnquist. Sarah Fritz is a congressional correspondent for the Los Angeles Times. She covered the White House for U.S. News and World Report. She's formerly a reporter for the United Press International and worked for the Pittsburgh Press. She is a Woodrow Wilson Fellow in 1987 and 88. Ms. Fritz is a board member of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. Representative Lee Hamilton, Democrat of Indiana, has represented Indiana's 9th District since 1965 and is senior member from Indiana. Lee and I were sworn into Congress on the same day, and he served with distinction all through his time in the Congress. He served for 7.5 years since my demise. He is chairman of the subcommittee on Europe and the Middle East of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He is chairman of the Select Committee to investigate covert arms transactions with Iran, the Iran Contra Committee. He's former chairman of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Representative Jim Leach, Republican of Iowa, has represented Iowa's 1st District since 1977. He's a former Foreign Service officer with the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. He was a delegate to the Geneva Disarmament Conference in 1971 and 72. He's ranking minority member of the Asian and Pacific Affairs Subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He's one of my leaders and bosses because he's chairman of the Republican Mainstream Committee, and I'm one of his vice chairs. He is also chairman of the Ripon Society. Senator George Mitchell had planned to be with us today and asked that we convey his disappointment that he could not be. He had illness in the family and had to remain in Maine this morning to cancel his day's schedule here. Brent Scowcroft served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs under President Johnson. He was National Security Advisor under President Ford. He was a member of President Carter's Advisory Committee on Arms Control. Most recently, General Scowcroft was a member of the Tower Commission investigating the Iran-Contra affair. He's currently Vice Chairman of Kissinger Associates Incorporated, and I have the privilege of being associated with him in a Soviet-American exchange called the Dartmouth Conference. And now we turn to our moderator, Norman Ornstein. He's a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He's been called the expert on the Congress. A frequent political commentator, he is a contributor to the Neil Lehrer Hour and election analyst for CBS News. He was series editor and co-host of the WETA TV series, Congress, We the People, and political editor for the public television series, The Lawmakers. He is currently a co-director of The People, Press, and Politics, a Times Mirror Company study of the American electorate. Mr. Chairman, we turn this meeting over to you with pleasure, and we'll hear you all with profit.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan, and welcome to the 1988 version of I've Got a Secret. If this works well, maybe we'll take it into syndication. Well, we have a lot of topics to cover here, ranging from the broadest ones, probably the most significant being where do we strike the balance between the public's right to know and the obvious need of any government for confidentiality, in some instances to protect other parties, in other instances to protect the national interest. It's not an easy line to draw, not an easy balance to strike, and we will have to discuss the broadest issue there. We have another broad issue that has been raised, I think, very sharply with the Iran-Contra affair, namely how much are we talking about an issue of secrecy here and how much the struggle between the branches of government. How much of this is really a tug of war which has been taken to a different level. We ought to discuss during the format today something about the reforms that have come up and others that might be suggested, some proposed by People for the American Way, others that are currently going through the Congress, including, I think most particularly, the so-called Cohen-McHugh bill, which would alter the procedures by which the administration has to notify the Congress about covert action. Covert action being, of course, only one of the areas of secrecy that we'll want to discuss. We'll want to talk about the classification or declassification or reclassification of information. We'll want to talk about things like the Freedom of Information Act as well. And as John Buchanan suggested, these national security decision directives, what role they play in making decisions that can have the force of law when they're not handled, of course, through the normal lawmaking process that we consider, and yet, of course, there are necessary ways in which the executive branch has to go about its business and take on its own responsibilities. But let's start with really the question that I think was most broadly raised by John Buchanan in his opening remarks and by the publication of People for the American Way, the thesis that there has been an explosion, almost literally, of secrecy during the last several years. Let me start with you, General Scowcroft, although before we do that, one little comment just simply on format. We have a lot of ground to cover in a relatively short period of time, and I will try and move us along to cover as much ground as we can, but I would hope that all of you as panelists would feel free to interject at any point and to take issue or to reaffirm something that another one of your panelists might have suggested. Only one small caveat in honor of Norman Lear: I would ask that none of you call any of the rest of you meathead. Other epithets will be all right. Now, General Scowcroft, has there been an explosion in secrecy in the last 5 or 8 or 10 years? Is it a different order than what we've seen in the past?
I think it is not. I think it stems from several things. It stems from the fact that this administration is one of the leakier ones itself in recent years, and therefore they have, trying to plug their own leaks, have turned to greater secrecy. There has been a sharpening of the executive legislative combat, which you referred to, and I think this is one of the results of that. But if you look back right at the founding of the Republic, the Constitutional Convention was one of the most secret conclaves we have ever had. There were no minutes to it. The only thing we know about it are the notes that James Madison was allowed to keep. Nobody took documents in, nobody took documents out. What more could the American people need to know about than the discussions about the system of government in which they're about to live? So we shouldn't think that all of a sudden secrecy is this big evil thing and our forefathers were pure and open and above board and didn't believe in it.
Okay, but let's talk just for a minute about some of the documentation that the report that we were all given suggests. The tremendous increase in the classification of information in the last few years. Is that a problem? Is it really there, or is it not really?
Sure, it's a problem. It's a perennial problem, and much of it is a bureaucratic problem. You know, a middle-level bureaucrat, when he's not sure about the information in the document, if he stamps secret on it, then he's protected. Then, then the thing won't get out, and if there's something in it that he should have noticed and didn't, he's protected. There's a natural institutional proclivity to classify, and that really needs to be guarded against. But the converse of that is, if you don't protect the kinds of things that need to be protected, if the government feels itself under siege, then the group of people that make decisions gets to be smaller and smaller and smaller, and pretty soon you start leaving people out that have a legitimate voice in the decision. They're left out because of the fear of leaks. So they're both sides.
Okay, it's clear that we're going to be coming back over and over again to the attitudinal problem that clearly contributes to a lot of this. But I see Congressman Hamilton a little antsy in his chair. Let's address this question to you, Congressman Hamilton. Has there been an explosion? And in some ways you probably take a little bit of issue with what General Scowcroft said.
I'm not sure I'd use the word explosion, but I am impressed that there has been an increase, a sharp increase, I think, in the amount of secrecy in government. I don't attribute all of this to the Reagan administration. I think it's a trend. But if you look at several categories, I think you'll find an increase in secrecy in every one of them. We've had, as you've mentioned, certainly an explosion of material that is classified. There are millions of items classified every year and very few items declassified. So there are more secrets there. We've had a sharp increase in the number of covert actions in recent years. That's secret activity. We've certainly had a very large increase in the black budget. John Buchanan mentioned this a few minutes ago. John, I was going to use the figure 20 billion. You used the figure 35 billion. I'm not sure which of us is right. But whatever it is, there's been a huge increase in the amount of money, most of it, I think, in the defense budget, the black budget for stealth programs, for Middle East activities, and for the National Security Agency. And then if you look also at the national security directives, the executive branch is using those, it seems to me, more and more to establish American foreign policy. And that is done secretly, and members of Congress simply don't know about them. Members of the Intelligence Committee do not know about them. So in a number of very specific areas, and perhaps others that I have not mentioned, it seems to me we have had a sharp increase in the amount of secrecy in government today, and it's a legitimate area of concern.
Why? Why do you think it's happened?
Why have we had the increase in secrecy? Well, I think there's a tremendous temptation in the executive branch to go the secret route. It's easier. They don't have to go through the rigors of public debate and discussion and hammering out policy in that manner. The temptation for any president, for any executive branch, is very great simply to sign a national security decision directive rather than putting the matter before the Congress for debate and discussion. So that's one reason. Classification, I think, is the reason that General Scowcroft mentioned is quite profound. The bureaucrat who classifies has a presumption, it seems to me, in favor of classification rather than declassification, because he's going to be protected, as General Scowcroft mentioned, if he keeps it secret. And so we've had this tremendous increase in classification. Those are some of the reasons.
Now, you have suggested, really, problems endemic to the executive, that every executive is going to want to, for natural reasons, to keep things secret because it's easier to operate that way, that every bureaucrat is going to want to classify things that might be embarrassing or that would be best kept behind closed doors. But that, of course, would be true in any event. It wouldn't explain why we have seen a sharp increase. So let me ask Mr. Cooper, who's been a part of the administration, of course, do you think this is a general problem for anybody placed in those positions? And if that's the case, would you agree that there's been an increase, and why would that have taken place in the last several years?
I think it is a general problem, not one that is somehow unique to the Reagan administration. I tend to agree entirely with what General Scowcroft has said, certainly as well as Mr. Hamilton. The middle-level bureaucrats who find it easier or perhaps self-protective to classify a document were in government before President Reagan arrived. They'll be there after he leaves. That is a tendency that his administration has had nothing to do with. I think beyond that, however, that it is inevitable that the phenomenon of increasing classification of information will continue to rise if such things as technology continue to become enhanced. It is just inevitable that this will be the case. That doesn't mean that it's bad necessarily. I think it's a false measure to say that because X number of documents were classified in 1980 and X plus 1 were classified in 1981, that we've got an explosion of classification. There may be thoroughly good reasons for that phenomenon, and indeed the standard hasn't changed. The standard is, will the information, if made public somehow, harm the national interest? And that's the kind of information that should well be classified and not made known publicly.
Okay. Now, of course, one could argue that if there's been a sharp increase in these sorts of things in the last few years, maybe it's not just because the executive has changed, but because they've been provoked by the Congress into different sorts of actions. Congressman Leach, do you think that the Congress has been different in the last few years, maybe requiring the executive to take some extraordinary measures here?
Well, I do think we have a little bit of a congressional executive confrontation over several issues, but Congress has been substantially the same over the last 30 or 40 years. As a Republican, it's fair to note it hasn't shifted much, and that's one of our problems. I'm sure Mr. Hamilton agrees with that. But I would stress here that it's absolutely true that the amount of classified material has gone up. It's not completely, therefore, ipso facto, the truth that secrecy has increased. Because while secrecy may be the enemy of participatory democracy, the enemies of secrecy have gotten far stronger too. And the enemies of secrecy are a much more educated Congress and a spectacularly more educated fourth estate, the press and the academia and the private sector. And so sources of information outside the confines of the executive branch have multiplied, I would suspect, in far greater magnitude than have the securitized instruments within the executive branch, and that's a perspective I think we're all going to have to consider. And I would only raise one other thing that I think is an aspect of this issue that we ought to sense very seriously. There seems to be an objection to the increase in the number of National Security Council directives. But the fact of the matter is that these at least imply some consideration of policy, and it's better to have a carefully derived directive than it is to give someone some sort of loose authority. If you look at the Iran Contra issue, for example, we do have an executive congressional confrontation. We've got a question of law that all of us would recognize. On the other hand, it's not related to the directive. It appears because there wasn't a very careful directive in many circumstances that these problems got out of hand.
Well, we'll certainly want to follow up on the issue of directives. So, Mr. Colby, I know you had something to say. After you deal with that, I would like to turn at least a little bit to the issue of covert action, since Congressman Hamilton brought it up, the increase in covert actions, and I wonder if you might simply address the issue of why. Does this have anything to do with the nature of foreign policy these days, too?
Well, I think it's a little bizarre to be sitting here and complaining about the enormous growth in secrecy. I last saw a classified document in 1976 when I last left office, and I have not seen one since. And yet I think I'm fairly well informed on some of the major activities that our country's been engaged in. Should we have a stealth bomber? Should we have a stealth fighter? A major discussion of a very secret weapon. Should we be aiding the rebels in Afghanistan? Should we be aiding the Contras in Nicaragua? Should we be aiding Savimbi in Angola? Should we be aiding the various rebel forces in Cambodia? Now, all of these are very secret operations, but I can assure you I've read all about them in the press. And I think you can apply that judgment to a lot of the other things, that there is a system here by which the main elements of a problem do have to be discussed with the Congress in order to get appropriations. The black budget doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a vote by the Congress that a certain amount of money will be turned over without the normal kinds of controls on it. Now, that was a conscious decision by the Congress to turn that kind of money over for reasons that seemed to be compelling, that, yes, we didn't want the normal kinds of procurement actions and competitive bids and all the rest of it that we applied to unclassified material. So this is applied. Now, why is there more covert action? Because the Reagan administration made absolutely no secret of the fact that it believed that we should have a more activist foreign policy after the days of the 70s. I remember that I figured out at one point that something of half the CIA's budget in the 1950s was devoted to covert action, and that by the early 70s that had descended to about 4 or 5% of the CIA budget. Why? Because of Vietnam, because of policy direction, and so forth. Has it gone up in the Reagan administration? I'm sure it has. I can't tell you the numbers. I have no idea. But the Reagan administration made no secret of its activist role in these regards. When we achieved consensus, as we did on a very large contribution, again, I speak from public information, to the Afghan rebels, nobody raised any question. When we had a problem and dissension in our government about whether we should aid the Nicaraguan Contras, yes, we had a big national debate and a whole series of resolutions in the Congress to limit that. Now, this is the workings of a free society on secret matters.
Okay, let me, we have two members of our panel who are a part of that explosion in sophistication on the outside who have not been heard from yet. Let's hear from them a little bit first, and then we'll open up more broadly and come back to some of the broader issues that we've joined. Sarah Fritz, do you find, as a member of the press, that it's harder for you to get information now, that the secrecy is a problem? Is it a problem for the press? Is it a problem that perhaps has been exacerbated by having so many more bright, aggressive reporters out digging up information and having so many sources?
Well, Norman, unlike the other people on this panel, I really don't see the explosion in secrecy as a kind of creeping bureaucratic problem. I think this administration, from its very outset, sent a strong signal that they were going to clamp down on information, and they've done it very effectively. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press has documented something like 200 separate actions that they've taken to cut back on the kind of information that's available. They've tried to weaken the Freedom of Information Act by legislation, and failing that, they've done it administratively. They've sent all kinds of other signals. They've threatened to sue. The CIA, you'll recall, threatened to sue a number of major publications at one point. The invasion of Grenada was the first military action of its kind in our entire history that reporters could not cover. So from the point of view of the press, there has been an incredible increase in the kind of secrecy and that we meet up with when we try to cover government. And it has made us much more aggressive. There's no question about it.
Do you find that aggressiveness pays off? Do you have difficulty getting sources who are willing to tell you things in the Congress or in the executive branch?
Aggressiveness does pay off. Obviously, there are things that we don't find out. But as Mr. Scowcroft noted, this has probably also been about the leakiest administration that we've had, and so we've benefited from that to some extent.
So to some degree, then, we have some checks and balances here that mitigate against the statutory problems. No, Scott.
No, not at all. Leaks go with secrecy. Leaks can't exist without secrecy. And I think we have to go back to what we talk about when we talk about what government secrecy in the national security sphere is. Most of us in the public think in terms of confidential, secret, top secret information. We think there's a barrier, and on the other side of the barrier is the public and hostile intelligence agencies, and somewhere in the middle is the Congress, and so forth. In fact, the system looks much different. The system is a system that has compartments within the government in which information is kept from other government agencies, from other government actors. In the Pentagon alone, there are now 10,000 compartments within special access programs. Some of these are very properly, rightfully, for the need to know. They're very sensitive programs, undersea acoustical testing, certain things involving our arms systems, weapons development, and so forth. But more than often than not, the way the system works today is it's a manipulation of information. And it's that ability to have some secrets and have only certain people have secrets, and then to leak out information selectively, often inaccurately, often partially, the trial balloons, the spins. That's in a sense, the key or the secret to what secrecy amounts to. This notion that there's somehow a tension between the leaker and the secrecy, I think is erroneous. You have two levels of secrecy, if you will, in this government. There are bureaucrats who are part of a very elaborate system who find it incredibly convenient to keep the public, the Congress, the press, public interest organizations, all those people that can ruin your day on Capitol Hill, out of the decision-making process. They do, for some reason, and I think they vary widely on it, but Generally, they seem to feel that the national security at the most sophisticated end of it is not a matter for public debate and public discussion. Beyond them are the political actors, and they're the ones who are constantly leaking the information. They're also the ones who are inadvertently, without thinking about it, saying, by the way, to a reporter on background, by the way, we learned at 10:43 yesterday afternoon. Well, that little bit of information, if it makes its way into the press, may be far more damaging than the substance of what the leak is. But they're not even aware, often, of the technical implications of it. In the old days, and by the old days I now mean back in the Carter administration and before, there was an ability to go back to the bureaucracy, to find out from somebody whether there was spin being put on it, what was involved, and that 10:43 a.m. detail, inevitably a career bureaucrat would say, can you leave that out of your story? That's not going to help us. That's going to identify the fact that a platform was passing overhead, or identify the ability to quickly decrypt information from a particular system or whatever, and it would have been left off. The Reagan administration comes along, NSDD 84 comes into place, one of the national security decision directives we were talking about today, and it includes polygraphing, it includes pre-publication review, and soon you have bureaucrats down in the structure unwilling to call you back. And so what you have at the top of the structure is a national security advisor who can leak his guts out, inappropriate and illegal under the law, by the way, with very rare exceptions, without any second guessing, without any ability to totally control the debate.
Anybody want to respond to that?
Yes, I think there's no doubt that there's some truth in what Scott says, but that's clearly the anguish cry of a reporter who can't get everything he wants to publish. You know, the problem of secrecy is a problem of government. And how do we run an effective government and still let the American people know the maximum amount, and especially the Congress, the maximum amount of what is going on so that they can make informed judgments? Bill Colby is absolutely right. There is very little in terms of national debate on which the American people are engaged that there is not adequate information to debate. Further, I would say there's no question that occasionally the executive branch uses leaks and so on, and they're probably leakier than the Congress is. But by and large, to tar everybody with this manipulative brush is wrong. Most of the executive branch people, most of the time, are dedicated to the national interest and to promoting the United States in the world. And I don't think we ought to forget that. Lastly, when a president does make a serious mistake, does not, for example, bring the Congress in and so on, a president can't run a policy over the long run that the Congress is not involved in. And I think the Iranian affair is one of the best examples of the price he paid. That price is inordinately higher than any other you could extract from the executive. It could have been fatal.
We will certainly come back to that and to some of the reasons behind the secrecy there. Lee Hamilton and then Jim Leach.
Norm, I wanted to pick up on a point that two have made, Bill Colby and Brent Scowcroft. Their point was that most matters come out into public debate, and I think that's true. And the illustrations they give were Nicaragua, aiding Savimbi, Afghanistan, and so forth. But what's interesting to me about those cases is not that they eventually came out into public discussion, but the manner in which the policy was started. The policy was started in secret. In each case, it is a major policy and a major foreign policy decision. Do you or do you not aid the Contras is an enormously important question, not just for Nicaragua, but for the U.S. position in Central America and Latin America. Do you or do you not aid Savimbi? Tremendously important question for U.S. policy in Africa, and so forth. When the policy was formulated, it was formulated in secret. It was presented to the Congress in secret, to the intelligence committees, and the information was very, very closely held for a very long period of time. Now, when you have operations of that size, you cannot keep them secret indefinitely, and we did not, and they emerge into the public debate. But the the terms of the debate have changed at that point. At that point, you're talking about a policy that is already in place, that has a lot of momentum behind it, that has fighters in the field, and the whole policy debate is a very different debate than when it originates, do you or do you not begin to aid the Contras. So I think it is true that these things do come out into the open in time, but the important point is that when policy is formulated, in these cases, the policy was formulated in secret.
I think Lee has a fair point, but I would stress in this sensitivity between Congress and the executive that the executive always has a preemptive right in terms of executive action, and the executive's always going to exercise it. And if you look back on several of the issues he just raised, I think one of the great questions is, why didn't Congress have guts enough at an earlier time period to say no when it had the legal capacity so to do? And I would criticize Congress more severely than I would the executive in both of those scores. The only thing I would raise is also a little bit of perspective. This is not new. One of the great journalists of this century, the liberal I.F. Stone, was denied the right to go to the State Department to the daily briefings, even though Soviet correspondents were. And he later commented that he thought most of the information put forth by our government was probably pretty accurate, but information was of a specific nature, and the great failures of government were virtually always big picture. And he used the example, body counts in Vietnam were generally speaking accurate, but to read very much from that would be like walking down the street and running into a man running out of a bank carrying a satchel full of money and waving a gun and ask, "What are you doing?" And if the man responded, "I'm waiting for a car," he'd be telling the truth, but it wouldn't be the big picture. And the big picture here is where I think the real problem resides. And in our kind of information swift society, it's amazing how the big picture is coming out very quickly and with a surprising degree of breadth. And the problem of secrecy, while real, is a problem that doesn't last very long. An example given today was Grenada. And that's a very sensitive thing with the press. And I personally share Sarah's thoughts on it. On the other hand, it was a successful, largely speaking, operation. And I guarantee you, if the executive had to do it over again, they'd have done it the same way, even though at the same time they all respond they'd like to develop new techniques and new ways of designating certain members of the press to bring in a kind of confidential way. But excuse me.
You're suggesting that it was successful because of that. I mean, you know, it could have been covered and also been successful.
I share that.
Look at these Reagan doctrine examples that we've got, the insurgencies. I mean, those things have been largely successful in Afghanistan, for example, even despite all of the fact that it was out in the open. So what was the reason for the secrecy?
I would just like to suggest on this last point that the press is very different from what it was in World War II. There are very few Ernie Pyles around. And the notion in World War II of the press, first and always American citizens, secondly reporters. I'm not sure that's always true anymore.
I got to answer that one. I got to answer that one. First of all, I really want to dispel the notion that somehow the press is willing to rush into print with any damn thing. And that's sort of the attitude that this administration has particularly, and it's sort of the general attitude. A good example being the Iran arms sales. The press knew about the Iran arms sales before they became public. And our sources asked us not to print the story because they claimed that it would harm hostages' lives. And the story did not appear in American papers until it was published overseas, which I think is a pretty good example.
Excuse me, I'd like to just comment briefly. That's not quite true. Jack Anderson printed it 6 months earlier, and you talk about a secrecy. One of the interesting aspects, it was not taken seriously, partly because Americans didn't provide the right perspective, including the press, to it, partly because he could not corroborate his source. And the reason he could not corroborate his source was the #1 person in the United States government. He got it in an interview with Ronald Wilson Reagan.
Well, shame on him.
It was at that moment that the information became unclassified, I guess. First of all, with respect to generalities, I don't think everybody in the press is something less than Ernie Powell, but by the same token, certainly not everybody in the press is. The same is true of the administration leakers, of which there are many, as Mr. Armstrong has pointed out. However, the bureaucracy is not airtight in terms of leaks, and leaks do emerge from the bureaucracy for no reason other than policy differences and an effort to have certain policies come out differently from the way it appears they're about to come out. And that is something that is not unique to this administration either. But the point I really want to address is one I think that was implied by Mr. Hamilton. It is that simply because these various operations in various areas of the world where we have supported certain insurgencies were begun in secrecy, we should recoil in horror from that fact. The point is, somebody made a decision, and presumably a decision in good faith and for reasons that at the moment appeared compelling, that the successful execution of a policy that advanced American national interests and national security, depended upon that policy being conducted covertly at that time. To be sure, it was not possible, and nobody, I am sure, assumed that it would be possible that the support or whatever else was involved could be maintained in confidence over the course of an extended period of time. But at least in its inception, that it was determined that the success of that policy, of its execution, depended upon secrecy. The same was true of at least the initial stages of Grenada, and that was indeed conducted successfully. Now, it might well be possible to say, well, it would have been just as successful otherwise. It is possible to say that, however, that it might well not be, and individuals made decisions, and I would suggest to you they were in good faith, to the effect that indeed the success of the mission could well be prejudiced by a breach of its operational security at the time.
Do you want to respond to that?
Well, only this observation. I certainly don't want to come across as a person who does not support covert actions. I do support covert actions. I think they're very frequently necessary, and I think they serve the national interest oftentimes. I am much more skeptical, however, about these very large-scale paramilitary actions. There are all kinds of covert actions. The ones that get the attention, of course, are the large-scale paramilitary. I personally have come to the conclusion that it's not possible to keep those secret very long. Furthermore, I guess I'd simply state the point that when a covert action becomes the core of your foreign policy, then I think it's a mistake to make foreign policy on the basis of a covert action. A covert action should complement, it should support American foreign policy, but it should not be the core of it. It should not be the essential feature of it, and that's the point. When you decide that you're going to aid the Contras in Nicaragua, or Mr. Zavimbi, or the guerrillas of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, those are enormously important foreign policy decisions, and I think they deserve to go through the normal process and of developing American foreign policy, which admittedly is a messy process and not as tidy, not very precise, and requires a lot of debate and discussion back and forth. But the result will be, in most cases, I think, a foreign policy that is more likely to have the support of the Congress and the support of the American people, and therefore is a policy that is more sustainable in the long run than a policy which is formulated and developed in secret.
Well, this is probably an appropriate time to turn more to covert action. Let's start with Bill Colby.
Well, Mr. Hamilton, in his usual thoughtful way, has outlined, I thought, a very important point. We have talked too much here as though it was either secret or open. And I would offer you that there are lots of places in between those two. That indeed we may have a requirement for an operation to be conducted in secret, which we, under the law, have to report to the congressional committees. That is so that you will have the independent judgment of those committees as to whether that program should continue or not, even though it theoretically remains totally secret. The committees have the opportunity to stop it. In 1975, they stopped us dead on an operation in Angola by a congressional resolution that said no activity. The Congress and a variety of resolutions under the Boland amendments, the different variations of it, exerted their control over our assistance to the Contras in Nicaragua, even though the details of that program were supposed to remain secret. There are many programs that can't be conducted if you must reveal the situation. It's my understanding, and I speak from an outsider point of view, that one of the conditions of assisting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan was that the United States not admit officially that its aid was going through Pakistan. And that was a condition that Pakistan, quite understandably, put on the continued dispatch of that aid. Now, if you want to do an operation and you depend upon the assistance of another country, which says this is either going to be secret or you're not going to do it, then I think you're entitled to make the judgment that the operation must be conducted secretly. It must be reported to the congressional committees who have been set up as surrogates for the normal democratic process. Now, in that regard, however, I think it's very rare that you will find a covert operation that is totally on its own, without any discussion of the background policy. Certainly, the policy of the United States toward the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan was pretty well outlined in the public print. There's no question about it as to what we thought about that. And similarly, the attitude of the United States toward the Sandinistas in recent years has been pretty obvious. It's no great secret operation that's conducted contrary to what is our apparent point of view. And therefore, I think when we're talking about this problem of secret operations, what is the secret? How important is that secret? Is there an envelope of policy in which it's going on? This is a way to remove the sort of absolute character, which otherwise we say, oh, it's either secret or it's open.
Okay, we have, of course, as you said, a process in place to keep actions covert while also notifying appropriate members of Congress. Does that work well? Obviously, we are now seeing an attempt to reform it, and there was some suggestion that it was avoided in the Iran Contra affair. Do we need reform of that process, or is that the problem? Is the problem the structure of it? Anybody want to take that on?
Well, I think, excuse me, but I think that obviously there was a failure to inform the committees for 10 months. There were other refusals to inform the committee. Stan Turner said that he could not look in the eye of a CIA officer that he was going to send in to Desert One to see whether the soil there would support a C-130 in a secret mission, and have to tell him that he was going to tell the Congress that he was going in. I mean, and I stand right with Stan on that. There's no way you can assure that young man that you're going to trot down and tell the Congress about his dangerous mission. This was before the whole mission was launched. It was a reconnaissance. Now, this does present certain dilemmas in how you do it. I think the Congress would probably have accepted that exception from the rule, as I think they do in many other regards where they don't ask the name of some secret agent, because they don't need the name. They need to know something about the activity.
But since then, Mr. Colby, since the Desert One operation to free hostages in Iran, we have had in place a mechanism where sensitive covert operations, of which this example would clearly be one, require notification of only 8 members of Congress. Would you have found, or would you stand with Stan Turner if he said he couldn't let this serviceman go while letting him know that he was going to let 8 members of Congress know, the leaders and the heads of the intelligence committees?
You put yourself in the position of that young officer. I'm going to tell 8 of the congressmen about your mission. No, he's not going.
So that balance doesn't work in every instance regardless?
That doesn't work in that case. Now, there are ways through this dilemma, and I think there are ways where you have to report it afterwards, and if the Congress thinks you made the wrong judgment on it, they can smite you for it. I mean, that kind of a solution you can work out. But the absolute rules, really, you'll find occasions where you can't use them.
I believe the present system of initiating covert action works pretty well and is a good system. And it's important to know what that system is. A president makes a determination to carry out a covert action. He does that obviously on the advice of the Central Intelligence Agency director and perhaps a lot of other people as well. And he decides to go ahead with it. And the law provides that in the ordinary case he give notice, under current law, timely notice to the Congress. And the Reagan administration has been very good, in the most part, for giving that notice. Iran Contra is very much an exception. And I think that procedure has worked very well. The President presents his notice not to the Congress, but to the intelligence committees in the ordinary case. The intelligence committees do not have the power to disapprove that covert action. They comment on it, they express their view on it, and the administration has always been very good in hearing out the criticisms of the covert action. If the Congress or if the intelligence committees don't approve of it, the only thing they can do is cut the money off. That takes a little time. It's a more complicated process. It's not easy to do in a legislative sense. And it takes action, of course, eventually by both houses and approval by the President. Only one instance of that, and that's the one we're all familiar with, that's Nicaragua, where the Congress tried to cut off that assistance. But in all other cases, the Congress, even if they had reservations about the covert action, did not seek to stop it. Now, there are some of my colleagues who believe that the Congress ought to have the power to disapprove a President's request for a covert action. The President notifies the intelligence committees that he wants to conduct a particular covert action, and the committees can in effect veto it or stop it. I do not personally agree with that, but some of my colleagues do support it. I think the system overall works pretty well, and we've had some instances where it broke down.
I just want to follow up with you in a couple of ways. Having served as you did as chairman of the Intelligence Committee for a period of time, you obviously have long experience here. The argument made frequently by the administration in these areas is that, well, there are leaks, and we can't trust even 8 members, much less the whole broad intelligence committees. In the area of covert actions, were you worried or did you see instances of leaks on the part of members of the Intelligence Committee? And what do you think of the proposal now before the Congress to criminalize this process, in a sense, to really try to provide the ultimate sanction by bringing about criminal penalties for leaks of classified information from members and others?
Well, I think the question of leaks is a difficult one, and I don't assume that all leaks come from the Congress. There are some very skillful bureaucrats over there who wait until the Congress is notified before they make the leak. Bill Casey used to say to me that he could never identify a single case of a leak from the House Intelligence Committee. I don't know that I'd go that far. We worked very hard not to have leaks, and I could cite dozens of top secret instances to you today of the most highly classified nature where we were informed by the administration and no leaks occurred from the Congress or from the executive branch. But we have to work constantly at this question of leaks, and I don't blame any administration for having serious reservations about providing information to the Congress, because leaks do occur. I tend to think that the whole problem of leaks is exaggerated. and that when these leaks occur, they are not as damaging to the American national interest as we think. But I don't, by that comment, mean to suggest that the leak is not a serious problem that we have to keep our eye on, and we in the Congress have a responsibility to be trustworthy, if you would, when the administration provides information to us. I do not agree with the proposal to put criminal sanctions on a member of Congress who leaks. I think that's a little extreme. Let me tell you how that would work. I go into a secret briefing, and then I walk out of that briefing, and you've got all these television cameras out here. And most members of Congress, I think, work very hard not to spill the beans, as it were, not to give a leak, but sometimes you might inadvertently do so. The better practice, I think, is not to go before those television cameras when you come out of the briefing, but that's not always followed, I'm afraid. Now, suppose you inadvertently leak classified information. Are you going to throw that member of Congress in jail? That's what that proposal would do. It seems a little extreme to me. I'm not prepared to support that at this point.
Okay, let me turn to General Scowcroft for a minute, who has a previous speaking engagement and will have to depart a little bit early. Let's follow up on this, and before you go, General, there's another question I wanted to ask you that seems to crop up over and over again as you read about this subject, namely the thesis that the Soviets and our other adversaries know all of this stuff anyhow, and that keeping this information secret is only keeping it secret from the people, not from the adversaries, and that these leaks, in fact, don't tell them anything that they don't know. Is there anything to that thesis?
Well, it's nonsense as a general proposition. Certainly the Soviets have a very sophisticated and skillful intelligence apparatus, but they don't know everything that goes on. And just as in our own intelligence, confirmation of what you suspect from a number of your sources, confirmation officially, is worth an awful lot of intelligence effort. And that is really what pins it down. That enables you to judge the value of all your sources out here that have been telling you these sorts of things, and it allows you to evaluate it. So in that sense, it is very, very important. Certainly the Soviets know a lot of it, but no, it is not a correct
All right, and then let me ask you one other question. The proposal now before the Congress to change or reform the system involving covert action is 48-hour notification, advance notification of any covert action. Obviously taken here in significant part, or proposed in significant part, because timely as a word was stretched beyond all recognition when it came to the Iran Contra affair. Is this an appropriate direction to go in?
I think it is not, and I think it's clear to remember that we cannot prevent error in the executive branch without paralyzing the ability to act. Now, what difference would 48 hours have made in the Iranian case? Presumably the supposition is that the President, had he listened to the wisdom of the intelligence committees, would have said, oh my goodness, this is a terrible idea, I won't do it. I think that's very, very unlikely to have happened. I think the President knew what he wanted to do and wanted to do it. In this case, I think the issue is oversight. And I think it is valuable and something that the Congress certainly needs to have. But I don't think oversight depends on 48-hour notification. Fundamentally, this system is going to work if we remember what John Buchanan said, and that is cooperation. The system, our separation of powers, is not designed to work. It's designed to protect the freedom of the individuals against an overpowering government. It works well only when the executive and the legislature are able to bridge these gaps, indeed the conflict that is built into the Constitution, and work together.
And that's been the problem then?
And that's been the problem, and it has been especially the problem in recent years when there's been increasing bitterness between the branches.
Okay, Scott Armstrong, you had something to say.
Well, I'm glad to get to speak before the General leaves. I should note that there are only 2 people up here who don't have honorable before their name, and we're both former members of the press, apparently not Ernie Piles.
No implication should be drawn from that.
But I think there's a reason for that, too, and I think that we're engaged in another massive manipulation of public opinion using secrecy again. And this time we're doing it in a way that buys Congress into the process. I happen to agree that the 48-hour notification is probably not what is most necessary. When you notify, when we're talking about oversight, effective congressional oversight, as contemplated by the Constitution, as opposed to overlooking things, which oversights become before this administration came into being, you're talking about either the ability to turn down a project, to do something that impedes it, which, by the way, I guess Congress's covert action is to leak. I mean, that's it. It may be the only covert action it can contemplate. But it's also to give feedback. And that feedback may not be given in an effective and thoughtful manner in 48 hours. I would submit that the executive, under the commander-in-chief power, probably was intended to have the kind of power to go forward with most covert actions without having to be hamstrung by 48-hour notice. However, timely, and this, I suppose, is a question what the appropriate amount of time is key to getting a discussion going within Congress. And then within Congress, insofar as information about the issue can be declassified, and I think in most instances it can, in the public domain. We had a bad lesson in constitutional history today. The Founding Fathers had their Constitutional Convention in secret, and the proceedings were secret, but they also had trouble getting together enough votes to put together a constitution. And when those that finally saw a way to do it through separation of powers thought their way through it, they tried to come up with a system that would not go as bad as the Constitutional Convention had, that would not have those same conflicts. And they anticipated a system that would be open. And the role of Congress is largely to publish the proceedings of what's going on in government by oversight, to regulate the Army and the Navy. Those powers are Article I powers, to account for where those go. In the press, and we often stick behind the First Amendment press and free speech powers, but in fact our duties as members of the press come from the First Amendment, but as citizens. We are citizens first. And the other part of the First Amendment, which we've forgotten about, is that Congress shall pass no law which inhibits the citizens' ability to petition for redress of their grievances. How can you petition for redress of grievances when you don't know what they are? And that's the fundamental underlying premise on which that tension between Congress, the public, or the press, and the executive exists. And it's an appropriate tension. There needs to be cooperation in the sense of trust, but that doesn't necessarily mean that when you find something going beyond the parameters of trust, that it isn't time to blow the whistle, it isn't time to make it come out straightforwardly with it.
Okay, some other time we will pursue the thesis that the Constitutional Convention would have gone better had it been open. But that's for another day. Sarah?
Yeah, well, I just want to add that I spent the first 4 years of the Reagan administration covering the White House and the second 4 covering the Congress. And I can tell you from personal experience that you get a lot more leaks from the White House than you do from the Congress. And in large part because of what Scott was saying, there are about 3 reasons why people leak. A, to sort of try out a policy. B, to scuttle a policy. And C, to brag that you're part of the policy. And Congress only has one of those reasons. And that's if they want to scuttle it. And so you have people with a lot more reason to leak in the White House. It's true. The other thing that I found about Congress, and it's certainly I don't want to say that this would apply to the 2 members sitting on either side of me, but frequently members, first of all, members, when the leaking comes from Congress, it comes from members and generally not from staff, especially when it's national security related. And quite often, the members are not familiar with what the staff has been told. I found in many occasions really trying desperately to get some information from members of Congress, and they really aren't up to speed on what the staff knows. Also, I might add that I've gotten some terrible misinformation from members of Congress who really didn't, because they're so busy, didn't really take time to sit down and look at the things that they'd been told.
Do you find then that more leaks from the Congress come from the staff than from the members? And
No. It's mostly from members, in my experience. Now, I don't know, maybe my experience is unusual, but I usually find from members more.
Okay.
There's an interesting point, I think, just as a footnote to that we have to remember when looking at what Congress does in the secrecy area. In the sensitive compartmented information area, there are roughly 150,000 or so clearances in the executive. Maybe it's more than that now, maybe it's up to 200,000. In Congress, there are 96 for staff. So you're really talking about a very limited capability for staff to staff things out. The members have to do their own work on secrecy, which again gives them more ability to manipulate by virtue of the fact that how far can a member go.
Let me just stop for a moment here to tell all the people in our audience you have a little index card in your portfolio. If you have questions, we will soon come to a question period. Would you please write them on your cards? And we are going to, I guess, pass the cards in what direction? Over towards the aisles, if you would. And then we will cull through them and ask some questions that come from the audience a little bit further on into the discussion. Let me turn to Jim Leach and then Chuck Cooper.
Well, as a representative of the body of the misinformed, let me make one historical little footnote, though, that leads in a little different direction, Scott. That if you remember at the founding of the Republic, when we wrote the Federalist Papers, that there was an assumption in foreign policy that the executive had a monopoly on knowledge. And it was really written right in there that that was one of the disadvantages of the legislative branch in this area. And I think one of the changes in the last several hundred years is not only has Congress shifted a bit in developing a foreign policy apparatus, but the public as a whole has in a dramatically different way, and Congress is a barometer or reflector of the public and often has access to that. And so one of the really true magnitudinal changes in the last 200 years in the separation of powers issue is that the knowledge gap is no longer near as great as it was thought would be the case when the Constitution was wrought. But let me just come back to two comments. One, I've agreed with virtually everything General Scowcroft has said, with one exception, and it's not trivial. I mean, very casually he said the vast majority of people in the executive branch hold the national public purpose to be the highest. The majority in the press do as well. Well, the fact of the matter is everybody in the executive branch holds the national purpose to be the highest, and everybody I've ever met in the press does. It's not a citizenship problem, but people differ on policies, and they differ on what's in the best interest and how they're reflected. And leaks occur to advance, largely speaking, as the major goal in my judgment, other than ego aspects of whispering something to the press, a perspective within the grand American scene trying to advance the public interest, whether from a liberal perspective or from a conservative. Everyone's doing this for fairly high-minded reasons. The executive hates it, Congress sometimes hates it, but the high-mindedness is never there, is never a real issue. Finally, in this regard, you got three P's. You got people, you got policies, you got procedures. On the leak problem, I certainly agree with Congressman Hamilton. Procedurally, there may be nuanceful changes that should be made, but procedures aren't the great difficulty. The problem are people and policies. And that's what you have elections, and that's what they're all about. But before people get too critical of this administration, remember that Ronald Reagan was elected because of perceived weakness under the Carter years, and one of the major themes was in the intelligence community in terms of we didn't, in the Reagan terminology, know what we were doing. Therefore, there appeared to be an argument for a mandate to increase the intelligence capacity of the United States. That means something to do with secrecy. It also means something to do with just information gathering, and probably in the Reagan mandate, more activism. I've never shared some of the conclusions on the wide use of covert operations, but like Congressman Hamilton, I think we ought to use them sometimes with great care. But I do think we ought to have understand that policies are more at issue than procedures.
Excuse me, I want to assure everybody that the executive branch is not unknowing about the leak problem, or that it has one, and an extraordinary one. And in fact, that is one of the many reasons that there's such a thing as sensitive compartmentalized information. That's the reason that the Iran Contra arms sales were so very, very closely held. Very few people outside of the actual cabinet knew about those matters. And it also...
And about 500 Iranians.
500 what?
Iranians.
There were undoubtedly people who had an operational need to know because the operation itself could not be conducted without that fact. But the point about compartmentalizing information is a simple one. It is a risk analysis. Every time someone is added to the charmed circle of informed individuals, the risk of a leak goes up. Whether that circle is whether you add 535 people to it or just 8 people to it, the so-called gang of 8. And somebody has to undertake that risk analysis. I think it's interesting to note that in the Carter administration there were, as I understand it, 3 occasions when prior notice under the National Security Act was not provided. In this administration, President Reagan, except for the Iran Contra arms, the Iran arms sales, provided prior notice on every occasion. And this leads me to the further point, and that is the requirement for 48-hour notice, which is now pending in Congress. It is entirely too Procrustean if indeed the purpose of secrecy is to ensure successful execution of a policy. That must be the determination as to when secrecy can be relaxed in some way, rather than some chronological determination, 48 hours. It may well be that the risks of spoiling the operation have not abated in 48 hours, and that additional people simply cannot, in the President's judgment, be admitted to the charmed circle. And all of this leads me to ask you to defend your statement that the timely notice requirement of the statute was stretched beyond all recognition in the Iran arms initiative. Now, it may well be that it was, but I would argue with the proposition that it was simply because X period of time passed before notice was provided.
Well, of course, timely is a word that leaves a lot of leeway. The question is how much leeway, and what did Congress really suggest when it wrote into the Intelligence Act timely notification? I think it did not mean waiting months and months before notification occurred. Let me ask you another question, and we'll move on, that was prompted by one of the things that you said. The sensitivity in the administration to leaks coming from the executive branch, which clearly has been there, and has been there within the administration. And there's been a variety of efforts made to try to bring this particular problem under control, not without controversy within the administration. The polygraph effort that Secretary of State Schultz didn't like very much. The effort to try to clamp down on officials writing when they left office and using sensitive information, which a number of officials didn't particularly like very much. It simply raises the broader question: is there a way in which you can legislate or regulate this particular problem in retrospect or in hindsight, as the administration is entering its final times and has tried in a lot of different ways to try to bring what everyone would suggest is a problem under control? Does it work? Can you find mechanisms that will stop or slow down or deter this sort of leaking that you or anybody else would agree is damaging?
I think there may be ways, but I don't think that anyone, either in the American public or in this or any other administration, would be willing to undertake them. We saw what happened when a particularly muscular form of detection of leaks, which is, in the end is the biggest problem for leaking. It is the unlikelihood of discovery. And the use of polygraphs was suggested in order to address that, and the administration backed off of that policy because of the reaction to it. So I dare say that that except for the pre-publication types of agreements that are available, which do provide substantial disincentives to disclosing classified information, that there's very little beyond that can be done. But I would like to say that I think those, I mean, if the notion is that an individual has access to classified information, because that individual can be trusted not to share it with people not entitled to have it, and therefore not risk the national security by that information being disclosed any more widely, then pre-publication agreements shouldn't be in the slightest bit odd or offensive. Surely that obligation does not terminate at such time as the individual's service in government terminates. It would terminate at such time as the information can be disclosed and not at the risk of harming the national security. And individuals who find that confining should also find the restrictions on their having security clearances in the first instance confining.
We have a limited amount of time, very little before we turn to questions. I'd like to ask each of our panelists if they have anything to add, and in particular, focus on what ought to be changed. We have turned a bit to the subject of reform here. It doesn't have to be in the form of formal reforms, but if you have any suggestions, now would be the time to raise them, and then we'll turn to some of the questions that have come from the audience. Let's go in order. Maybe we'll turn to Scott Armstrong first.
Well, first of all, and I think it's responsive to Chuck's point about what how you can stop leaks. The first thing to do is to get rid of 85% of what's controlled inside the information control system that doesn't need to be there. General Stilwell, in his more candid moments, will put a figure roughly in that magnitude of what could be declassified tomorrow with no damage to the national security. You get rid of that 85%, people will respect the reasons why you need to control the other 15%, and then an SCI agreement will begin to mean something. And if you don't believe that, I'll give you this example. When's the last time you found out who a reporter on one of these major leaks, who his source was? Reporters understand secrecy. Reporters can keep secrets. Editors can keep secrets. Newsrooms can keep secrets. Why? Because they respect the process. They're not infallible, but they do a lot better job of it than the intelligence community does.
Before you continue, Scott, let me just ask Mr. Colby, do you agree with that? 85% of what is classified could be declassified and it wouldn't cause any problem?
No, I certainly don't believe it. I agree with that figure. One of the problems here is a very practical thing. Something can be a very great secret today and be publicly announced tomorrow, but all the documents today have stamps on them that say secret. Are you going to go back on all those documents and cancel the stamps? You can have an army of people to do that. That's the problem with it. We've compromised by subjecting it to freedom of information. Then we discovered that we had all these demands. Would CIA please report all of its secret operations against the Soviet Union? And it was required for a while to go through the process and look at all of its documents about the secret operations against the Soviet Union in order to come to the conclusion, no, it wouldn't give any of them. And finally, the Congress passed a perfectly simple, sensible solution to that, that the CIA's operational material need not be looked at for the Freedom of Information Act. Now, is that going to conclude some things that didn't need to be secret? Yes, it probably will. But on the other hand, it was a practical solution to a practical problem.
Did you have another point, Scott?
Yes, I mean, that brings me to my other point, which is the fact that you can automatically downgrade information and if in rare exceptions, continue it. But you don't have to go...
We've tried that, you know. We had a whole system of trying that kind of thing, and it never worked.
But I think when you look at the vast amount of information that's considered secret today, that's held for reasons that expire relatively quickly, you begin to see that that impedes the ability to keep other things secret. Another thing that can be done is we can remove the covert action capability from the military. I think there are questions about where that resides and how many different compartments you have and how able Congress is to monitor all that. And lastly, I think, although I would be loath in general to suggest that Congress needs more staff, when it comes to the intelligence area, when it comes to sophisticated national security areas, I would submit that Congress is understaffed. They need to have better staff integration. I don't think you need to consolidate committees, but you may want to consolidate staffs. But we're talking about, again, a relative few dozen people that monitor virtually everything in the national security area on behalf of Congress. That's just not enough.
Congressman Hamilton.
I think the question is what kind of recommendations I'd suggest. I have a number in mind. I'll just tick them off very quickly. The most important thing, of course, is just to obey the law, respect the law that we already have in place. There's a marvelous quotation in your book here from Eagle Crow with respect to national security. The point is that we must not let the phrase national security become a block to thinking, to analysis. Oftentimes, the mere mention of the word national security blocks any analysis or debate on a question, and we assume that something that is put forward for national security purposes is therefore good and valid, and those who oppose it are somehow unpatriotic and suspect. And I think we have to get away from that frame of mind. I agree with Scott's observations about classification. When everything is classified, nothing is classified, one of the justices said, and that's absolutely right. We need to enforce the right to know principle. That was the problem in the Pollard case that you may recall. He had a security clearance, but he had access to all kinds of things that had nothing to do with the area that he was working in. The mere fact that the person has a top secret clearance should not necessarily let that person into all types of classified information, but only information that is needed to know. We clearly have to give a lot more attention to the black budget. The problem on the black budget is that it has fallen between the cracks. The Armed Services Committee thinks the Intelligence Committee is dealing with it, the Intelligence Committee thinks the Armed Services Committee is dealing with it, and in effect, no rigorous oversight has been given to that black budget, or at least insufficient oversight. We've talked a lot about covert actions. I think only modest changes need be made there. I want to see us all the time focusing on the question how we make government more accountable and how we make it more responsive. And if you focus on those questions, the presumption ought to be in favor of the right to know. But that's a presumption that is rebuttable, as the lawyers would say, and in certain cases would not apply.
To expedite matters, and so we can get as quickly as possible to questions, let me just ask the rest of the panelists if they have any particular suggestions to make, and we can make them quickly, and then we'll move along, rather than let you all go in order. Sarah, do you have
I'll be just real quick. My concern is that the things that this administration has put in place become the level from which we move into the next administration. I'd like to see some declaration on the side of both the new administration and the Congress that we've gone too far here.
Truce.
And that we begin to cooperatively begin to sort of dismantle some of this stuff that was a part of the war between the Congress and the Reagan administration.
Let me just quickly say that I share Congressman Hamilton's concerns, but most importantly, secrecy is not the most important issue. The problem here is sensitivity to law. And I would think in terms of recommendations based on the Iran Contra affair, for example, the NSC would be well advised to staff itself with more lawyers than they had in the past. They would also be well advised to take a little more historical view and maybe put a historian, at least an institutional memory type or two within the serious decision-making apparatus. And let me give one example here. If we think of the Gaddafi episode, I don't think anyone would disagree that that should have been held secret, but there are some judgments of whether you attempt to assassinate a head of state. And if you recall, in the wake of the Kennedy assassination, we did an institutional memory circumstance that in the 50s, because of the Hitler issue, philosophically, most Americans could accept under some circumstances the principle of assassination. That is, would you have shot Hitler? On the other hand, as time went on in this society, in the 60s and 70s, we came to a decision, who do we place in jeopardy with an assassination attempt? And it's very likely the President of the United States of America, because other armies can cannot defeat our army, but they can shoot our people. And that's why Israel didn't have an assassination policy till several months ago, and why I think this country ought to be very concerned about that, and that's a major issue of secrecy. Finally, let me just say that if law is the issue, it's not only should we be concerned about conformity with American law, but we ought to also be concerned about expanding international law, because secrecy, after all, is a reflection of a kind of nationalistic foreign policy, and whether or not we want to move in a more internationalist direction, I think, is something Americans ought to ask themselves very seriously.
Okay. Very quickly, Chuck Cooper.
Yes. First, I think Scott Armstrong made some important suggestions earlier. I disagree with how much we could declassify, but I do think that within rational budgetary constraints, every effort should be made to declassify information. His overall principal point is accurate. I think I also particularly fond of his consolidation of congressional staff's point, if not committees. But I would just like to make known that the President and the executive branch has not failed to take note that some serious re-examination of the covert action, to be specific, covert action procedures and review procedures within the executive branch should be and have been undertaken. For example, all covert actions are now reviewed very periodically, systematically reviewed, every single one of them. There has been a new position in the NSC created for a full-time civilian lawyer who is part and parcel of that review and everything else the NSC does, as far as I can tell. The Department of Justice, in the person of the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel, is admitted to that review process systematically and institutionally. So some important lessons were learned by everybody in that, and none the least the executive branch.
Let me turn, if you will, to the questions. The questions have several themes running through them. One of them is what to do about these national security decision directives, and how do we strike a balance there. I'll raise a couple of those and maybe raise them more broadly for the panel. Another stream of questions, not surprisingly, is about covert action and what can we do there. And let me start with one of those, which was directed at the members of Congress on the panel. It was
is that the Congress has to be much more rigorous in its oversight when these covert actions are presented to it. Now, if you take the position that all covert actions are bad, or most of them are bad, then you'd want to restructure the law. You might even there are people who want to do away with all covert actions, not have any covert actions. I've expressed my view, and I think it's clearly the majority view in the Congress, that covert actions are important at times, and that the President ought to have that power. But if you're going to get better control of these, there's only one way to do it, and that is for the Congress to exercise its oversight power more vigorously. What happens in a covert action, I believe, is that the bureaucracy tilts in the direction that the President favors. Now, I'm not critical of that. The bureaucracy should tilt in the direction that the President favors because he's the leader of the executive branch. But there are very few people in the executive branch who will walk into the cabinet room and say to the President of the United States, with regard to a particular policy, Mr. President, I think this policy is crazy. I just think you're all wet here. I haven't heard that kind of talk very often in a cabinet room or to a president. The great perspective that the Congress brings to the covert action is that you have people who are independent of the President, who have an independent political base, and who will give the President their best judgment about whether or not a particular covert action could go forward, and who can give that judgment without fear of being ridiculed or demoted or ostracized or shunned within the executive branch. And that's the importance of congressional input into the covert action.
Let me follow up just with a further question in this regard. Clearly, Congress does not have the ability to stop directly, but one of the things we've seen in the last couple of years is instances where members of Congress have threatened to leak information about something they saw as especially ludicrous to put the kibosh on some questionable covert actions. What do you two gentlemen think of that? Is that a legitimate thing to do?
No, it is not a legitimate thing to do. I've agonized over that question. It bothers me a great deal. And I don't know the answer to it, I don't think, but I do not think it is appropriate for a member of Congress to leak information that is classified. He has no authority to do that. He's in violation of the law when he does it, and he should not do it. Now, the most difficult problem for me is when the executive branch, even the president, misstates what the intelligence information is, and at least misstates it in a way which is contrary to what has been provided to the intelligence committees. Let me try to give an example that won't be too offensive, I think, to anybody. When Mr. Yurchenko went back to the Soviet Union, it was the impression stated in the press that it was a genuine case of defection and to the United States, and a genuine case of redefection. Yurchenko got here, didn't work out like he thought it was going to work out, changed his mind, despite the efforts to keep him here, he went back. And all of us would acknowledge that he has the right to go back. Statements were made at a very, very high level to suggest that it was not a genuine case of redefection, but that he was in fact a Soviet plant here, and it was not in accord with intelligence information. Now, what does a member of Congress do in that kind of instance? I can give you a dozen of them. What's your obligation? Well, I think your obligation is to fight it out in the executive branch, call it to their attention, argue back and forth with them, but I don't think it's your responsibility to go to the cameras and say, I think that was misstated. At least that's the conclusion I reached. I'm not dead sure I'm right. I've sure agonized about it a lot.
Well, I agree with Lee entirely. I would just raise one other perspective. If the issue is covert actions that some people in this room might think are inappropriate, though, Congress isn't your only stopping point. And one of the things that has happened in many, many administrations, and I think one ought to give a lot more attention to, is the inter-executive branch decision-making on covert actions. Is there a balance between the input of the Department of State, the Department of Defense, with the intelligence community? And here, I would just stress that it's a major import in the decision-making that many different bodies within the executive have input, and that you will find under any administration far-ranging differences of opinion. And it isn't always an issue of standing up to the president. It's an alternative to standing up to the one group of the president's people standing up to another group of the president's people. And if you have checks and balance institutionally, you're more likely to have less kinds of mistakes made in the final measure. And I know of numerous covert actions that have been proposed by institutions of primary responsibility that have been, in effect, derailed before they occurred by other institutions. Whether they should have been or not is a matter of conjecture, but that if you have institutional checks and balances, it saves a congressional dilemma.
I just have a question for Congressman Hamilton. You talked about this in terms of a kind of dialogue with the president. But do you really have a dialogue with the president? Aren't you really talking to people at the National Security Council? And even in the Iran Contra affair, if you had been talking to them, would that message have ever gotten to the president?
I don't know the answer to your question. And you can't take every little problem to the president. He's got a lot of things to do other than talk to you about some of your concerns. And yet, by and large, I've never felt shut off from making my views known to high-level officials. Secretaries have been very good about their willingness to hear from me. So I don't have any complaint at that point. I feel like I get my point across, and I challenge the administration on their interpretation of the intelligence data. They don't usually end up agreeing with me, but at least I've made my point. And I feel that's all I can do. And to go public at that point, I think, is contrary to law. and a member ought not to do that.
Again, there are a lot of steps that the individual congressman can take if he objects to a certain covert action. He can raise his voice, insist that the director report his view to the president, or insist that he can write a letter to the Secretary of State, this classified letter. He can gather a group of his fellows on the committee and get a negative vote on the committee, which I assure you the president will take note of, not necessarily agree with, but nonetheless will take note of. And of course, next year's budget is going to have to be looked at. And if a direct connection is made between you go ahead on this policy and you will suffer next budget year, I guarantee you that'll catch the attention of the administration.
Let me move on to the next question, which is for Mr. Cooper. Isn't the Iran Contra affair the case that proves the viability of congressional oversight of intelligence, since this embarrassing event would never have been allowed to occur had the Congress been properly informed?
I think, on the contrary, it is the best example of the unlikelihood that simple reporting to Congress prior notice inevitably is going to derail what some, I guess, think are bad ideas. The point is, in that very case, two of the president's cabinet members, his Secretary of Defense, his Secretary of State, adamantly, repeatedly advised the president not to engage in that policy. We have seen hours of testimony describing those confidential communications to the president. It seems to me to be far-fetched that in the face of the president's decision, notwithstanding the advice of his closest cabinet members, to go forward with that initiative, that the negative reaction of the Gang of Eight would have somehow changed his mind. It's just not at all clear that it would have changed his mind. The president was compelled for reasons that he determined were good and sufficient and indeed compelling. And one thing we have to keep in mind is that's why we elect presidents. This debate can't take place without some recognition of the constitutional backdrop. There are certainly covert actions involving powers that are delegated under the Constitution to Congress, and that Congress can therefore tell the president plain and simple no. A covert action involving arms sales, for example, would involve the president's, the Congress's authority over international commerce. They can say no. But a covert action that doesn't involve some such delegated power to Congress, for example, a covert action that just involves rescuing hostages, the Congress cannot say no. The Constitution invests in the president the unilateral, irreducible authority to engage in that covert operation. And indeed, that's why we elect presidents, to make those kinds of very difficult decisions. In the end, we have another chance every 4 years if the aftermath of it is unacceptable or if it was an unwise policy. But presidents have to make those difficult decisions. They should do so with all the advice and counsel from reasonable and responsible individuals, including the Gang of Eight and the intelligence committees, if that is consistent in the president's judgment with operational security. But you know, we have a president, and that's one of the things he has to do.
We have a number of questions that have been asked about these national security decision directives, memos signed by the president that have the force of policy. Let me combine them into one question and see if somebody wants to take it, and then we'll turn directly to the audience and see if we have a question or two before we wrap up. Is this wise, is the basic thrust of many of these questions? Is this the way in which we are in fact making foreign policy? And if it is, and if it is increasingly so, should Congress have some role here, at least in seeing them or in commenting on them before they actually take effect? Who would like to take that on? Scott first.
I don't think anybody objects to the notion that the National Security Council or the President, through whatever mechanism he chooses, may want to bump heads together and come out with a coherent policy. I don't think that's the concern. I think what we've seen is an attempt to create in the National Security Council a kind of unique institution that's protected by the President's executive privilege, by his confidentiality, and yet has the size and ability and functions of an agency. And I think that's where the problem comes in with these national security decision directives, that we've got an agency that's playing that has no accountability. There's no oversight. And as a result of no oversight, there's no ability to inform the public. The National Security Council, as a matter of practice, generally doesn't respond to the Freedom of Information Act. It declared large classes of records to be unavailable under the Freedom of Information Act because they were the personal property of whoever office they were in. Everything in Oliver North's office was not considered to be a National Security Council record until after the committees requested them and began to secure them. Up to that point, they were his personal papers. I think that's the kind of concern you have about an agency that's created with no accountability to the Congress or to the American people.
Does Congress have more access to these things?
Norm, let me just point out what happens here. I've been in hearings when a cabinet member will make reference to a national security decision directive as the basis of policy. And then you ask the cabinet member, well, may we see that directive so we understand the basis of policy? The answer is no, we can't see it. Congress does not have access to the National Security Decision Directive. I would not take the position that a president ought not to have the power to issue a National Security Decision Directive. There are appropriate circumstances. They do have to be used, it seems to me, with prudence and with restraint. And I'm beginning to think that we should require some kind of a reporting mechanism. Now, I haven't thought that entirely through as to just how that ought to be done. But it's very, very frustrating to a member of Congress to have cited to him a national security directive that is a basis of policy and then not be able to see that national security directory or not directive or not even be able to have it summarized for you. So this is one area that I think just needs more thinking and analysis and reflection on. And I think a reporting mechanism of some kind to the intelligence committees, not to all members of Congress, ought to be looked at pretty carefully.
Okay. One
I would disagree with that. I think an executive branch ought to have its own capacity to come up with decisions and to keep those decisions somewhat confidential. And I would only stress the background of all of this, and we ought to be very careful, was a National Security Council that acted like a functioning part of the bureaucracy and acted, it didn't just think. And that's a whole separate issue, but that aspect of acting, the Colonel North episode, was not based as much on NSDDs, as at least that we know of, as it was on what appeared to be a president kind of winking or an administration winking, saying, you go do it, Ali, you're a can-do kind of guy. And in that regard, the National Security Directive might well be a more refined restrainer of action than it is a compeller of action. And all I would say is the great plus of the National Security Directives is that it does require multi-institutional input in it, generally speaking, and it does require a kind of thinking through of policy that in some administrations doesn't always occur. And so I am all for the institution of having these directives, and I'm all for keeping them confidential.
I might just add on that just the point. You know, the whole answer to the NSDD does not occur in the NSDD itself. You have assistant secretaries, you have secretaries up testifying on the policy questions being discussed all the time, be they defense, be they foreign policy, be they intelligence, whatever. There are a variety of ways in which the substance of the directive is reported to Congress in the normal exchange of information about what our policies are.
Congressman Leach has nailed this issue. If you ask me, national security decision directives are not anything inherently evil. They are simply the President's instructions to his national security apparatus, his subordinates, his instruments for implementing national security policy. He can do it sitting around the table in the sit room if he wants to. And nobody would argue that those counsels and conversations should be taped and made public or provided to anybody. Or he can reduce them to writing in ways that reduce the amount of bickering and squabbling over turf and every other imaginable thing that might ensue afterwards if oral instructions were relied upon. These are simply the President's way of managing the national security apparatus.
Why has there been such a dramatic increase in them during this administration, Chuck?
Well, I will accept as true that statement. I don't know anything about previous administrations. I do know that the use of written instructions to the national security apparatus has been a commonplace of the executive branch, at least since the Truman administration. It may well be that the President finds this to be a good and useful management tool, and he uses it frequently. I don't see why that is some kind of reflection of any kind of cloak and dagger type of thing. It's just the President instructing his subordinates, which is a confidential enterprise.
And to defend the President just briefly, every president has a different management style. This president wanted to have consensual decision-making as much as possible, in which the top cabinet departments came together in a focused kind of way, and it really fit his style. And I personally think it's a better way to operate than it is seat of the pants. And I respect very much the effort that has gone into them. I differ probably as much as any Republican with the policies that have sometimes come forth. But that's very different than the institution of having these directives. And I think they are very positively done.
I think
Lee Hamilton, and then I think we'll have to wrap it up.
I've never seen many NSDDs, but I think the key question here is, to what extent are these a statement of policy about which we don't know, or about which members of Congress don't know, or to what extent are they the detailed carrying out of that policy? If they are the latter, then I don't think Congress really has a right to ask for them. But if they are the former, if they are things that Congress has not been informed about in any way, then there's some question.
But even if they are the former, if I could interrupt, it doesn't necessarily follow that Congress or anybody else has some kind of a right to the President's confidential instructions to his subordinates. If, let us say, it deals with a subject matter that is uniquely and irreducibly a presidential power, one that Congress cannot influence through legislation. For example, let's say the NSDD contains the terms of reference for negotiation of a particular kind of treaty or some treaty. Well, there's no doubt that negotiating treaties is a presidential power, uniquely and irreducibly. Sooner or later, the Senate is going to see the fruits of that negotiation and going to get to pass on it through its advice and consent function. But since the time that John Jay was writing Federalist Papers, it has been recognized that secrecy in the negotiation of treaties or other types of foreign relationships is a necessary evil sometimes. It doesn't follow that anyone is entitled to the contents of an NSDD, even if it includes policy as opposed to simply tactics for executing policy.
I think the distinction that has to be made is the distinction between implementation of foreign policy and formulation of foreign policy. If the National Security Directive is merely a management tool, as it's been described here, if it's merely a directive to let his subordinates know what the policy is, then I think I don't have any objection to it. And I think most national security decision directives fall into that category, may I say. On the other hand, if that national security decision directive is the manner in which the President is formulating American foreign policy, then he is using that national security decision directive to bypass the ordinary constitutional means of formulating American foreign policy in this country, and it is a mistake to use the National Security Decision Directive to formulate American foreign policy, because the Constitution presupposes that the formulation of American foreign policy is a shared power between the executive and the Congress. My impression is that the National Security Decision Directive is an appropriate instrument, but it has been used too frequently, its use is growing, and that it is clearly now getting into the area of policy formulation. And I think it therefore becomes a tool we have to look at pretty carefully.
One last comment, Jim.
Well, I think that distinction is very mischievous. I mean, all policies are combinations of formulations and implementations, and you cannot draw that distinction the way you've just had, Lee. All one has to think to themselves, would you rather have an executive branch carefully write down what it wants to do with the input of as many institutionally appropriate people as it chooses, or would you rather have it go seat of the pants? And if you think that it ought to go as carefully as possible, particularly with an executive that is somewhat diffident, I think one might say this administration is best off with a large number of national security directives, and this has been a very positive aspect of a Reagan kind of administration. All policy is formulative and implementary, and I just don't see how you can possibly make that distinction. The question here is whether it's legal or illegal, and if you have an illegal NSDD, everybody here ought to be concerned. But that isn't what's at issue.
Well, clearly we have difficulty coming up with any kind of a structure that can work, and clearly we have a lot of disagreements, but we do have, I think, one core here on this panel, and that is the recognition that we have a serious breach of trust that's occurred over a long period of time between the Congress and the executive, and that that is at the root of many of the problems, although many of them are endemic perhaps to a free society trying to cope with the balance between the right to know and the need to make things happen and to get things done. I want to thank the panel for their comments and the vigor with which they pursued them, the audience for their questions, People for the American Way for putting on this session. We will conclude now. For those who are here in this room, there'll be a light lunch served at the back. Thank you.
If you'd like more information on this program, you can write to People for the American Way at 2000 M Street Northwest, Suite 400, Washington, D.C., 20036. And this programming reminder, this forum on government secrecy will re-air on C-SPAN just before 5 a.m. Eastern Time.